Hey, it's Drybear. Back again with my latest Diablo 4 Necromancer build guide. Now in the last patch, patch 1.0.3, we saw some pretty big buffs to basic abilities and some nightmare changes, XP changes, that sort of thing. But there was something else in the patch notes that really piqued my interest that made me want to make a build around it to see how good it could possibly be. And that is a shocking buff to Sever, the core skill for Necromancer. The base damage for Sever went up 3%, which is more than most of the buffs in the entire patch notes, and the return damage of the second half of Sever went up 15%. And I've always loved Sever as an ability. It's one of my favorite usages in the Necromancer kit, but typically it gets used as a deliverer of shadow dot damage to trigger Blighted or to trigger Shadow Blight and get some more extra bonus out of things like Aspect of Decay. So I wondered, how good could Sever be as a traditional core skill on its own? And to my surprise, it's actually pretty good. So today we're gonna walk through my Sever-focused Immortal Severance Necromancer Endgame build for high-end Nightmare and difficult content. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me in the community, the next time you buy a new sweatshirt, the two little threads on the end that allow you to readjust the hood will never ever be aligned. One will always be lower than the other. Now, like I mentioned, you traditionally see Sever used as a vessel to apply shadow damage over time, trigger things like Blighted, Shadow Blight, or the Aspect of Decay, which scales off of Shadow Blight in the Wither tree. And most of the time, it's really just an extra source of shadow damage that does damage with other means. But I wanted to run it as a true core skill as the primary source of your damage with crit damage, crit chance, and lots of damage scaling. And what's cool about this build is it actually scales really, really well because, as I'm sure you're aware, if you play Necromancer, especially as a Shadow Necromancer, there are tons and tons of shadow percent damage scaling in the aspects, the Paragon board, and of course the stats on your gear. So you can scale up the base damage of Sever tremendously, and then if you get high crit chance and high crit damage and vulnerable damage on top of that, Sever actually starts to hit like a mother freaking truck. And on top of that, it hits multiple times and in a large area, so it'll deal damage, come back, deal damage, does damage every time it swings out, and it does all these different stages of damage, which are incredibly good for high clearing. In pushing, I was able to clear through the 80s, and even towards the end of my testing was pushing upwards of Nightmare 90, and a lot of this was with very unoptimized gear, only 2 or 3 useful stats on each piece. I've been respecking like crazy, so I haven't had the gold to get perfect gear or rolls, but it's really just feature complete, and it started pushing really, really high Nightmare and doing tons of ridiculous damage while also being very safe. The core of this build relies on bonus damage scaling from the Blighted aspect, which is when your Shadow Blight deals damage, or when you do shadow damage to Blighted targets 10 times, you get a huge damage bonus. And a lot of the traditional Shadow builds that you see now rely on this heavily. And also it uses an aspect that I haven't really been able to use in a build ever, which is Aspect of the Damned. When you have a double curse on a target, it increases the shadow damage you do on the target. One of the things I don't like about the Blighted aspect is that it gives you crazy burst when it procs, and then when it doesn't, if you're built all around Blighted, your damage is next to nothing. It's very, very small. And I wanted to smooth that out a little bit for a much more fun playstyle and something that's very easy to farm with and do tons of damage with. So we use Aspect of the Damned to give us bonus damage all the time with double curse targets, and then we stack up the Blighted aspect with our Shadow Bone Storm using Ultimate Shadow, and then Sever with the damage from that. And because of that, when we stack everyone up with Corpse Tendril, we can control when Blighted procs, and then when it does, we do insane burst damage from things like Grasping Veins for bonus crit and crit chance, tons of extra bonus damage on that, and then a lot of easy spending as well. And then unlike a traditional Shadow Blight, Shadow dot damage build, we run with things like Essence that give us core skill crit damage. We have very high crit damage on Sever, and it starts to hit really hard when we're stacking together. So if you're someone who loves the Sever ability, but you don't want to run like an Explosive Mist build where you're doing Corpse Blights everywhere and Shadow Dots and waiting for Blighted to proc, waiting for Wither to proc, you want to do actual upfront burst damage, then this build is for you. Now down below in the description, I have the full build built out on d4builds.gg, including all of the gear, the gems, the Book of the Dead, as well as all the stat priorities. We have the full skill tree listed out as well. and a full Paragon board that you can review and reference as you go along. And of course, this is a Drybear guide, so it has a Drybear one sheet. I have this full one sheet uploaded online that you can find in the description and down below in the comments. So you can have this as a reference for what stats to get, what legendaries to get. Everything that you need to know to make the build work is on one page. That's why I call it the one sheet. Then you have notes in the bottom right that go over the rotation, the priorities, how to adjust the build for farming, how to adjust the build for high nightmare pushing when you need to have more defense involved, and then all of the gems, best elixirs, best incenses, and sigil affixes to avoid that are really, really detrimental to the build. Let's get started with the skill tree. So we'll start there to get everything set up. So the skill tree itself, I've currently set this to, so the way it works for high nightmares, it's very difficult to run anything above nightmare 80 without blood mist. So you have to swap that in. But typically, we would just swap blood mist for Iron Maiden to get the damned bonus. You have the extra damage there, and then it also has the extra healing, which when you can run Iron Maiden, it's awesome. I actually really like Iron Maiden. It's just hard to fit into builds because the skill slot availability is pretty limited and difficult to wake up for. But you have the extra fact that it generates essence for you and it heals you. It has insanely high value of life on kill, which is really, really good. So we're gonna come up and we're actually gonna pick up bone splinters here. You could run Reap. I found that the biggest weakness of this build was generating essence in single target, mainly because you just spend so much with Sever. With other Shadow Blight builds with Sever, you're not really spending as much. You're just trying to build up corpse explosions and blight it everywhere and go into blood mist, and then you're not spending Sever constantly for big, big damage, and so you don't really run out of essence as much. But we like running bone splinters for the sheer fact that it allows us to run with exposed flesh. This allows you to, when you deal damage with a bone skill to a vulnerable target, you generate essence. Both bone splinters and your bone storm will proc this, and it's a very easy way to get essence. And also, if you're pushing or if you're just normal farming, easy different like Helltide, things like that, I also found that you can run with Umbral on your other ring. So if you have Umbral and you also have exposed flesh in this build, you generate essence like crazy, because Decrepify and Corpse Tendril both proc Umbral, and then you proc off exposed flesh with Bone Storm and Bone Splinters, and your essence gen is insane. You can freely just cast Sever all day long and there's no problem. I also like running with Vulnerable on Bone Splinters. You get a little bit of value out of getting the crit chance off Acolyte's Bone Splinters. The reason I like running this is it means that Bone Splinters can trigger Vulnerable, and then it can give you essence off Vulnerable, which means that this ability for generating essence and proccing Might is insanely, insanely strong. We go for Unliving Energy and then Imperfectly Balanced because we're spending with core skills. And then we want to max out Sever and then get the Sever that does Vulnerable every 4th cast. We have Vulnerable with our Bone Splinters. We have Vulnerable with our Sever. Alternating between those, we get a lot of Vulnerable uptime. And then you do actually want Hewed Flesh. Now, because we're not generating corpses with Reap normally, since we want to have kind of more bursty damage outside of Reap, again, you can run Reap. This will give you damage reduction and faster stacking of Blighted, but it won't give you the same kind of essence gen that Bone Splinters will when you run with Exposed Flesh, which is why I ended up swapping that out for the build. But having 3 Hewed Flesh with enough lucky hit means that we spawn corpses, specifically just for spawning Corpse Tendrils, which will give us big bonus damage. We also want to run with Death's Embrace, Amplify Damage, and Death's Reach. All of these do great things for us. Damage reduction here, and then bonus damage with Amplify Damage and Death's Reach. Then you want to run the Double Curse so that we can run Damned for shadow damage as well. So you run all the way up to Abhorrent Iron Maiden for the life on kill. Huge 5% of your maximum life, not base life, maximum life when the enemy dies. It's insane amounts of healing and keeps you healthy. And then Decrepify for the damage reduction primarily. If you're running aspect of the Umbral, the slow will give you essence as well. And then additionally, we reset our cooldowns when we lucky hit on targets that have Decrepify, which gives us a nice reset for our ultimate. Coming down to the Macabre tree, we get Corpse Tendril with the modifier for Vulnerable. This gives us insane burst damage with Vulnerable application, as well as the Grasping Veins legendary. And on top of that, again, if you're running Umbral, when you apply Corpse Tendril, big influx of essence. You can basically fully, with enough density, you can fill your essence bar with Corpse Tendril, fill your essence bar with Iron Maiden, fill your essence bar with Decrepify, and then fill your essence bar back and forth, and you get insane amounts of essence, and you just spend all day. It's actually super fun to farm with this build when you have the essence gem. And when we get all of the darkness skills here under the darkness build, This gives us movement speed when we damage enemies with darkness skills. Crippling Darkness is actually a lifesaver in High Nightmare. You can get some really long stuns with this, and especially when they are not CC immune, you get it saved my life many times where you get the 3-second stun. You can pull points out of these two as they're not as important for the build and put them elsewhere if you really want, like more distant damage, but this is super useful. And again, if you're running Umbral with this build for farming, I would recommend Crippling Darkness, because when this stuns, you will get essence back, which is really cool. Then we take full advantage of Terror and Gloom. This gives us damage, shadow damage. When we deal damage, it stacks up on the targets, which gives us more shadow damage. And then when they are slowed and or stunned, which we get with either the Crippling Darkness or Corpse Tendrils, we get even more bonus damage, which scales us up even more. For ultimate, we go for Bone Storm. This gives us crit strike chance while it's active, which makes our Sever even stronger. And then we get damage reduction, which you can never have enough of, to be honest. And it actually does pretty good damage. And then we're going to modify it with Ultimate Shadow, which means that we get shadow damage from this. This allows us to stack up Blighted, as well as stack up Gloom and Terror, which is super useful, and it keeps us alive at the same time. We also want the bonus attack speed when healthy. This applies to you and your minions. While typically this is a minion skill, it actually does apply to you when you're healthy, so it's free attack speed. And then damage reduction when you have no minions, and then increased sacrifice bonus for your 2 warriors and mages for that bonus there. And then we get Shadow Blight, which is another damage scaler, and it also will trigger bonus shadow damage as well. So all of this is around making Sever, the star of the build, the most damage that it possibly can. For Book of the Dead, because I always forget to do this, we want crit damage from your Iron Golem. We are primarily a crit core skill build. We also want vulnerable damage from the Cold Mages, and then we want to sacrifice the Reapers for shadow damage. But if you really want to, you can actually run crit chance here. I think overall shadow damage is superior because it'll give you higher numbers and overall value, but you can run crit chance if that's what you're after. Now let's go over the gear and stats that you need for this build. It will require 1 unique, though it does work without it. So until you get Greaves of the Empty Tomb, you can run this with some other utility option on your Greaves, perfectly fine. And then when you get Greaves of the Tomb, it just gets even better, because not only does it apply a shadow damage over time, which means that you get your damage scaling from the build, we get the damage reduction that we get from shadow as well. It also will apply some extra damage to you, and it actually has lucky hit shadow damage on it as well, which allows us to proc more lucky hit in general. For the stats, we want overall enough cooldown reduction to maintain Bone Storm, as much damage reduction as we can possibly get, as that is pretty much required for any difficult content in the game. And we want to run Grasping Veins on our main weapon, Blighted on our offhand, Damned on our ring, Ossuous Gale on our amulet, and then Ultimate Shadow for offense on our gloves. This gives us a bunch of bonus damage, and then Ossuous Gale gives us a longer duration of the Bone Storm, which allows us to not only stay alive because we're running Shielding Storm on our helm, which gives us barrier from Bone Storm, but also because we're running Ultimate Shadow on gloves, our Bone Storm does shadow damage, allowing us to proc Blighted with just 2 shadow skills, and Greaves of the Empty Tomb gives us that bonus very easily. Now again, if you're farming for this, you can swap Damned to your amulet or Blighted to your amulet for extra damage. If you care more about the burst, you can do Blighted on the amulet. If you care more about damage being smoother overall, then you can run Damned on your amulet for that bonus as well. Then for the rest of defense, we want Might on our chest and Disobedience on our pants. You can easily swap the position of these as long as you have both of these for the damage reduction and armor that you get from that. For weapon, because we rely on Lucky Hit, we have Lucky Hit for Exposed Flesh, we have Lucky Hit for our Shadow Stun, and we have Lucky Hit for Abhorrent Decrepify. We want to run a Wand. Wands come with a natural 15% Lucky Hit on them, and they work great for damage. We also want Lucky Hit on as many places as we can get, like the Focus Offhand, the Rings, and the Glove. You can also re-roll the Helm on a Sorceress and get Lucky Hit while you have a barrier up on your Helm, which can give you even more Lucky Hit on top of that. And remember that we have Lucky Hit with shadow damage from our boots as well. Run at least Exposed Flesh on one of your rings, even if it's min value. You can see that mine in game is min value, so it can get significantly better. It can only go up from there, and it's Exposed Flesh with just Bone Splinters and Bone Storm is enough to maintain your essence on their own. And then if you want even more, you can swap out, say, Ossuous Gale or Damned for aspect of the Umbral on your other ring to give you even more essence gen and you can spam Sever to your heart's content to do insane amounts of damage. For Helm, we want cooldown reduction, total armor, max life, barrier generation, or lucky hit barrier if you want to swap to a Sorc that's level 25 and can reroll. For chest and for legs, we want damage reduction distant, damage reduction close, and then either max life or damage reduction from shadow dotted enemies. As long as you have 3 damage reductions and then a max life or 4 damage reductions, you have a very good chest or pants piece for pushing High Nightmare. For gloves, we want 4 Sever. It'll be 3 Sever at base, and then when you upgrade it to max level, it'll be 4 ranks of Sever. Lucky hit, crit chance, and lucky hit chance to restore resource, because we want to be spamming Sever as hard as we can. The more we spam, the more damage that we deal. For your wand, you want vulnerable damage, core skill damage, damage to shadow dotted enemies, and then either % damage to stunned, % damage to crowd controlled, or % damage to distant or close. All of these are about the same in their usefulness overall. When it goes to amulet, we want 3 damage reductions, DR flat, DR distant, or DR shadow or close. And then you also want either three charges of, or 3 stacks of gloom. It'll be 2 at base. You upgrade it, it becomes 3. This gives you a bunch of extra shadow damage, or just % cooldown reduction to maintain uptime on Bone Storm. For your rings, vulnerable damage is great, shadow damage is very good, and then you want lucky hit to proc. And then you can also run either max life, which I recommend for High Nightmare, or crit damage for extra scaling on top of that. And then for your offhand, your focus, which needs to be a focus for your offensive aspect, you want cooldown reduction, lucky hit, damage reduction shadow is a huge one. Even though it's an offensive weapon, offensive focus in your offhand, you still can get damage reduction on it, and damage reduction shadow is very, very good for this build. And then you want another lucky hit, chance to restore resource. Super strong there. For our Paragon glyphs, we're going to be running with 6 glyphs in this build: Darkness, Exploit, Control, Abyssal, and Essence, and Territorial, which we'll go over in a second once we get to that point for the Paragon. These are your gems. These are your best elixirs, incenses, and bad sigil affixes. You want to avoid vulnerable and shadow resist, because that lowers your damage by quite a lot if you can't maintain it. And vulnerable resist is also pretty bad, because you need vulnerable with exposed flesh to generate essence. Also, on top of that, it should go without saying that resource drain is also another really bad one for this as well. And this one is very typical. This is like kind of the quintessential setup. Topaz for damage reduction, crowd control, Emerald for crit damage to vuln, and then Skull is armor. This is like your, if you don't know what gems to run, this is the safest one to run, as it works with almost every single build in the game. For rotation, you want to maintain all your defensive buffs, full stacks of disobedience, maintain might, maintain the sever dot on all mobs, so you trigger your bonus damage to shadow, and your damage reduction from targets that are dotted. So make sure you're throwing out severs out regularly to keep that Greaves of the Tomb dot on the enemies, keep yourself safe. Maintain Decrepify for the damage reduction and for the cooldown reduction, and then pop Bone Storm for shield to keep yourself alive, and it helps you proc your Blighted with Sever as well. Use Corpse Tendril for the Grasping Veins buff and to bring enemies together to easily double curse them. And when they get pulled in from Corpse Tendril, apply Iron Maiden, apply Decrepify, and start going to town spamming Sever. You want to be in melee range for this moment, because then your Bone Storm is hitting them for shadow damage, you're hitting them for Sever. Usually, because you only have 2 shadow skills, one being melee range, you won't proc Blighted until you get into melee range with Bone Storm and Sever, which is awesome because it means that unlike other Shadow Blight builds, you're not proccing your Blighted effect when you're not dealing damage. You're kind of getting a couple stacks here and there from using your Sever at range. And then when you go into melee range, you proc it very quickly, and then you start spamming and doing insane damage, which combines with the Corpse Tendril Grasping Veins buff as well. Super strong. If you ever run out of essence, just use Bone Splinter to apply vulnerable and generate essence, and of course, to maintain your might buff. For High Nightmare pushing, you want to swap out Aspect of the Damned and instead put in something that you can replace with for damage. I recommend Conceited Aspect. This gives you 25% damage while you're shielded. It's not as much damage as Damned, but we're also going to be swapping out Iron Maiden for Blood Mist because, well, that's just how things work for Necromancer and High Nightmare. You have to have Blood Mist. So since we're losing Iron Maiden, we can't proc Aspect of the Damned anymore. Slot in Conceited Aspect for bonus damage, and then use Bone Storm for defense. And at high levels, just only engage after a Corpse Tendril, get that bonus damage. Make sure you have Bone Storm up so you don't die, and then keep your damage or damage reduction buffs up as well. When you're farming, you can place Aspect of the Damned or Aspect of the Blighted on your amulet instead of also Scale, and then you can equip both Exposed Flesh and Aspect of the Umbral on your rings and generate insane amounts of essence to just clear whatever is in your way. Moving on to Paragon. In the starting board here, we're going to go up and pick up Control. The starting board is one of the best boards for intelligence. It's actually almost fully maxed. The only board that's better than this is Flesh Eater, and this is actually a good amount here. So it's a perfect spot to put Control, give us tons of extra damage to crowd control targets. They're either going to be stunned or slowed or both, which gives us some nice bonus damage from this, and we need intelligence, so we're going to grab all of that there. And our first board is actually going to be Wither here, but since we are not focusing on damage over time, like a true Blighted build, we actually don't need the legendary node Wither. We want to focus on crit damage and shadow damage as much as we can. We come up here and we pick up the Abyssal node. This is a great spot for it because it gives you 10% increased non-physical damage, but even more important is that it increases the nodes nearby that give you non-physical damage, which in this case is shadow damage, shadow damage, shadow damage, shadow damage, shadow damage, shadow damage. All of this is excellent shadow damage for your character. You get a whole bunch of value from that in that specific spot because it does give you even more. So you can see I got 20% shadow damage off of this just by having this node, and it's a low cost node as well. It doesn't cost you all that much anyway. So we're gonna come up here and pick up that. We're gonna skip the legendary node. Then we're gonna branch off and just use the glyph spots for a few other specific locations. We also want the territorial glyph here. I love having close damage because it increases your burst when you go in with Bone Storm, and it gives you damage reduction close, which is a nice pickup as well. On top of that, because we're running Ossuous Gale, the start of your Bone Storm will pick up and consume 5 corpses. It'll pick up 8 corpses in general, but you can proc this very easily at the start of your Bone Storm. So if you spawn corpses with Hewed Flesh, pull everyone in with Corpse Tendril, and then jump, like dash in and pop your Bone Storm, you'll get a 40% damage increase for 6 seconds, on top of the Grasping Veins damage bonus, on top of all the shadow damage bonus, Blighted, all of that going off at once, and you can burn down anything standing in your way. This one's a little more advanced because it's a time window. It's only at the start of Bone Storm, but you can actually use Ossuous Gale to proc this, which is pretty cool as well. We want to pop over here into the Scent of Death node. This one is pretty much part of every Necro build just because it gives you either damage reduction or damage. Both of those are super valuable. We want to get as much crit damage as we can because we are a core skill spending build. So all the crit damage we can pick up here along the way is going to be super valuable. And then we want to pick up the Darkness Glyph. Not only does this give us damage reduction to targets that are shadow dotted, but also gives us a huge amount of shadow damage. You can see this is already giving me 107% shadow damage. Super, super beneficial. Very, very good. We come up here and we go into Bloodbath because it is one of 2 boards that has 9 dexterity nodes around the glyph. So we come in here for Exploit, which is a dexterity glyph. We get this for 38.8% vulnerable damage. And then we want to leave the Withered board and go up north into the Bone Graft board, which is another great spot for dexterity. It is the other one that has 9 dexterity nodes on it. And this will be used for Essence, which gives us crit damage with core skills, a huge amount, 73% crit damage on top of that. And then the passive is when you deal critical strikes to targets that are not healthy, so anything below 80%, the critical strikes overall deal 22% increased damage. So Essence here gives us a big, big gain in damage overall. So that is the Paragon. Super easy to pick up. Some really nice things here. Some of my favorites, by the way, are in here as well. Damage reduction against targets that are shadow dotted is huge. You get 2% damage reduction. All of these damage reductions adding up on top of it makes you super tanky, plus the Bone Storm. All of this adds together and you get amazing amounts of survivability while also doing crazy amounts of damage with your Sever. And that is the Immortal Severance build. It's super fun, way stronger than I thought it was going to be. It might actually be a high A or low S in how strong it is. You can clear insane amounts of content with this. It's very safe with high burst damage, and I've had a lot of fun making it because I personally just like the ability Sever rather than just doing a true Explosive Mist, Blighted Decay build, which is all about dots and that sort of thing. If you found value in the video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and pop by my live stream. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.